The thing I miss the most is never really being able to see it for the first time. I don't have that initial jolt of not knowing it was up here and then coming up and seeing it for the first time.
The High Line was not always an elevated rail line. Originally, the trains actually ran down on 10th Avenue, right here. And it was called Death Avenue because so many people were run over. A group of mothers got together and convinced the railroad to hire a guy on horseback that would run in front of the train, and he became known as the West Side Cowboy. But still about one person a year was run over, so they elevated it. This was a freight line. The Chelsea Market was the old Nabisco factory. This was a refrigerated warehouse, and the trains would actually go in and load and unload and come in and out of the city.
A lot of it's hidden. You see it over the street, but then it goes behind buildings. And I'd always just thought that's a lot of pieces of something that doesn't exist anymore. I was doing an article about changes that were happening in West Chelsea and really looking at what was here. And that's when I realized that it was still intact. It was unbroken. 22 blocks, 30 feet in the air.
In the summer of 1999, I read that it was going to be demolished. Went to this community board meeting, sat next to Josh. We'd never met before. By the end of the meeting, we realized we were the only two people interested in saving it. Most people either didn't care or very actively wanted to tear it down.
I don't think they knew exactly what they would use it for, how it would survive.
Bear in mind that very few people ever did see the High Line itself because you couldn't see it. You only caught glimpses of it from the streets below.
So when you told people about your idea to try and save the High Line, they had no concept of what that would be like.
And then there were Sternfeld's photographs, of course, and all of a sudden those did reveal the magic of the top.
People saw that it had turned into this bucolic green field of wild grasses and trees. It was a place unlike any other place in New York City, so it made sense to turn it into a park. We got together with James Corner and we put together a team which included l'Observatoire for Lighting, Bureau Happer for Structural Engineering, Piet Oudolf, a Dutch horticulturist who really understands wild grasses and plants.
I remember the thing that clicked for me and said, these people are the people for us. Liz said the special quality of the High Line was that it was illicit. And nobody else had said that word.
It had that edge of danger, that edge of abandonment, and that rather powerful urban sort of archaeological effect that came from that.
The High Line was interesting to us as a place that was good to break into.
It's not cleaned up, right? You see in the rear yards, you see in the junkyards, you see that side of the city that's normally denied you.
The High Line, you had to do the minimal interventions because you wanted to keep what was magical. You wanted to keep the old and just enough new interventions to make it something special.
I often say that one of our jobs was to protect it from architecture. In fact, I think if you look at our early competition boards, you'll see that we had proposals for all kinds of things that could go up here. It would be wonderful to have an urban beach, really make it a water feature. You could swim in it. In the winter, it would freeze over. One of my favorites, actually, and maybe someday we'll do this, was an elevator which had trees on top.
There was one feature that had trampolines in it, and they had kids bouncing high up in the air up here. All sorts of really interesting and somewhat out there ideas in their earliest proposals.
And then we pulled back from that. I think what won us the competition was the idea of a concrete planking system. Rather than pouring a hardscape or a macadam path, it was a planking system which could feather into the landscape. Actually, we looked at concrete sidewalks where the concrete had been broken and the grass was forcing its way through, and there was incredible tension between the green and the concrete. Piet Oudolf planned this so that whenever you come up, whatever month, there'll always be something incredible in bloom. I was here last week and this wasn't this, it was something else. It was really important for us to keep it simple, to kind of allow the structure itself to survive and breathe and be understood. First time I came up here, I discovered the plants were incredibly opportunistic. Where there was sun, you had one kind of grass that was growing. Where there was shade, you had a different plant that was growing. When we started thinking about the design, we realized that we could be as opportunistic as the plants. Where there was sun, we said, this is a place for sunbathing. When it crossed 10th Avenue, it was just too juicy a moment to not remove some steel and make a sunken overlook. Initially, DOT, Department of Public Transportation, wanted us to put 8-foot-high fences at every street crossing. And so we thought, well, why not dive down so that you're way below the railing height? But also open it up to the traffic.
The sunken overlook is a very strong gesture, not only setting up a consensual space of observation and performance, but also it frames something that is normally thought of as extremely banal.
It's a bit like looking into a fireplace. You sit there and you watch the cars and you watch the red taillights. After a while, your mind escapes to some other place.
I mean, it reminds me of these Andy Warhol films of people sleeping. There is nothing to see. But the world's most boring street is now unbelievably exciting. Why? Because you can sit above it and look at it, which you can't do anywhere else in New York. The High Line is simply a way to make you see your world differently.
Even some of their crazier ideas have worked into reality. They had this one concept of a flyover where the walkway came up and went through a canopy of trees.
We realized there was not a place where it would simply be green from edge to edge of the High Line, because if we did that, you wouldn't be able to walk through it. And we thought, it would be nice to do a flyover.
And I think when we saw that, that's an interesting idea, but it'll never. They figured out how to do it. We have the Falcone flyover at 26th Street.
You go up 8 feet above the rail bed, and we're trying to grow the High Line as it originally was below. And this is an area which was always in shade, where there were sumacs and shade trees. And eventually these trees will grow, or they'll become high enough that you'll be walking in a canopy of leaves. There's this wonderful moment here where there's always been a billboard. In the restoration process, everything was ripped down and that history would be gone. But we thought it'd be nice to keep the memory of it. So at 26th Street, we have that frame, but it also becomes a frame back to the city.
It's not a one-way activity. You both were hinting at that. It's a two-way activity. It's always about a reciprocity. And so the frame is focusing the people from inside looking out, but it's also focusing the people outside looking in. So while it might be confused with theater, it's actually an inversion, and it turns the city into an actor and the people into actors at the same time.
I remember the first time I was at the old Paris Opera, when there was an intermission and I walked out into the lobby space and I was as much a performer and looking at other people, and there was this incredible kind of joie de vivre between the public during intermission. When you come up on the High Line now, people are looking at the city in a way they haven't looked at it before, looking at plants in a way they haven't looked at before, and looking at each other in a way they haven't looked before.
One of the great things about public space is that you can be a voyeur. What people want to do in public space is be with people. They want to see other people.
There's a concept in landscape tradition of what's called prospect and refuge. And prospect has to do with sort of being on the hilltop and being able to survey the territory. And refuge is the hidden view. And you yourself are not visible, but you're able to peep into a certain situation.
Visuality, or the culture of vision, has always been part of our work. Exhibitionism, voyeurism.
When we did the Brasserie restaurant, every time somebody comes to the door, there's a snapshot taken, which is displayed on a monitor. I think there are like 12 or 13 images up, and like a Congo line, next person comes in, bumps off the last one.
Doing a work in the Seagram building is a fantastic opportunity, but it comes with all the paradox of here's a great glass and steel building where we can build in a massive stone base that has absolutely no visual relationship with the street. So that irony and that weird paradox was what triggered the opportunity to make an electronic connection with the street.
To me, that project is very different than, say, the one that you did in the PepsiCo building. You filmed people without their knowledge, and from a distance.
But really got busted for it.
Well, right.
It was called Overexposed.
Overexposed, right.
And it was a pan of the Pepsi building that was designed by Bunchef. It's a beautiful building, beautifully proportioned.
It's almost monitor format.
Yeah. It's what Jack Benny, it's the way he crosses his arms.
So Liz decided we wanted to film looking in the windows of the building.
It's a continuous pan that stops in every framed piece of the curtain wall. We superimposed snapshots and the narration.
No one has entered the frame since he disappeared last fall.
Of a fictional voyeur.
Except the odd co-worker spinning his Rolodex from time to time, and the late-night cleaning crew.
We were in the hotel room across the street, and I remember that if we just opened the curtains and sat there and watched, it would have been fine. But because we had a video camera aimed at windows and slowly moving, I remember there was one point somebody in another office had binoculars. Right?
Yes.
And looking back at us.
Wonderful.
Right? And when they'd pick up the phone, and you watch down the other corner, somebody else pick up the phone.
It's very shock tattoo.
And you watch everybody being told
That's
they're
amazing.
being filmed, right?
The general story about Diller and Scofidio is that they, as young architects, were more like artists, and then they become very, very successful major architects globally and locally. And for most people, that's impossible.
They were known, or at least the two principals, Rick Scofidio and Liz Diller, were known for years as very abstruse theorists who occupied a very particular ivory tower in academia.
When it was coming down to sort of the final decision, what you typically do is you go visit the designer's past works. And Rick Scofidio always gets really angry when I say this, but they didn't have a lot. They hadn't built a lot.
They'd done concept installations, they'd done some stage work, but they'd never done a building. Certainly not anything on the size and scope of Lincoln Center.
We don't have to worry about that phrase, be careful what you wish for, because we never wish for it. Right? Most people, when they start a practice, they say, someday we'll have a huge firm, we'll be a big office, but we never went into architecture that way. We went into architecture to look at it as a discipline, not as a profession.
So Rick was my teacher.
Well, let's not go back that far.
Well, why not?
There is an elevator, and you're in the elevator with your boyfriend. Professor is in the elevator. The elevator stops, he gets off, and your boyfriend says you're going to end up with him.
Yeah.
True?
I would normally say don't believe everything you read, but, but that happens to be true. I think the days when I was going to school at Cooper and you were teaching and we decided to hook up at some point, there was a healthy dissatisfaction with the profession because we felt it was intellectually bankrupt. We looked toward independent practices more. We looked toward what was happening in art, in the performing arts, performance art, and we're really interested in, I think, the New York scene in the 70s.
The late 60s and early 70s was a recession, social upheaval, and therefore architecture as a built profession goes down, like today. Architects who wanted to work conceptually turned to exhibitions of drawing and modeling. Liz and Rick were very different. Liz and Rick decided to build their ideas in a way that was both tangible, effective, and public, but not at the scale of buildings.
We very much wanted to put our ideas out into the public space, so whether we borrowed those public spaces and borrowed money or stole those spaces, we just went after it. And it was all very short-lived. It was up and then it was down.
I remember an early chair with a television on it. There was that wonderful project in Times Square where they had a pair of lips which asked questions of you as you approached it.
Hey you, want to buy a vowel?
Projects like Art on the Beach and Art in the Anchorage, performance works at La Mama.
Remember Diller and Scofidio, early on they're exhibiting in little galleries in the Lower East Side. And slowly their space, their territory of occupation gets bigger and bigger. Museum of Modern Art installation, kind of a retrospective at the Whitney.
That was a real border crossing for us because our stuff was always unofficial and was always accessible to anyone and was not in an official art space.
But what's arriving is a degree of respectability and visibility. In other words, they're getting a kind of signal that there's something there.
Because our early projects were public, it's almost like being able to take Polaroids. We could have an idea, we could put it out, see a reaction, and then bring it back and think about it. And I think that was really important to the way we developed.
In 1999, Rick and Liz actually received the prestigious MacArthur Grant. It's a grant that normally has been understood in the popular imagination as a genius grant.
I remember imagining what it would be to be a MacArthur recipient, but I never in a million years thought it would happen to us, and because it was never a possibility in architecture.
For the first time, the grant was awarded in the field of architecture.
We weren't called artists. Somehow we were acknowledged as architects, and to us it was a confirmation of the fact that we were doing architecture all along. The money was fantastic, but the acknowledgement really pushed us into bigger territory than we had ever thought.
Yeah, and the bigger territory was your new apartment. Finally.
We put a down payment on it.
Yes, you put a down payment on a new apartment. That's what you did with that money. I remember very well. Thank goodness we didn't have to knock every morning to see if you were naked or not before we came in to go to work.
I first remember stumbling upon him at the Whitney when they had that solo show.
It was a completely different way of looking at space and time, and it was a social commentary, and it was entertaining. I think there was some hammer going through the wall.
These suitcases, open suitcases, and you walk through and you thought, well, what is this? I mean, it was amusing sort of as installation art, but one thought, they are, after all, architects, and one would like to actually see some architecture. In a funny way, I think they almost addressed this with their marvelous Blur building.
The Blur building, it's exactly the intersection between architecture, technology, art, exhibition, and so on.
We had kind of fallen in love with this idea of making a building out of mist. We produced these boards that said we're going to build a cloud on the lake. We really didn't know how we were going to do that, as I remember. And, it was a competition.
From an architectural point of view, it was a very specific technological accomplishment.
It was a building composed of the lake by the operation of a very sophisticated set of high-powered, fine-density water sprays, which took water from the lake, purified the water, and sprayed it in a cloud, which enveloped this lozenge-shaped structure. You donned raincoats and walked across this long walkway into the building itself, where suddenly you were lost in a cloud.
But the blur building wasn't a building. So that's the trick of the blur building, right? The blur building was just a blur.
Which was almost a way of thumbing their nose at those people who were saying, why don't you build something finally?
The short-term experimental building is the real laboratory for architects. They really relish this. This is just, there's money there, there's time, there's a deadline, there's an audience, you got to perform. It's a little bit like a screen test, right? You got to show up and be good. Now they showed up and they were good, and surely that played some role in people later giving them the big buildings.
At some point along the way, that's Charles joined our studio as a staff member, and across the years became more and more involved in design and decision making, and we realized that there was a really great connection there.
Happened with the brasserie, and as soon as we started working on it together, just the ideas started clicking, and we really realized that it was a good fit.
I think that adding the R to D plus S, or D plus S plus R, was a really, really strong move for a whole lot of reasons. One is it showed generosity. Architecture is not a field noted for its generosity, so to identify a younger person in your office that you regard as an equal and to give them equal billing, very, very positive. And of course, 3 is more interesting than 2, right? Especially if the 2's a couple. And in architecture, that's always the case. So with 3, their ability to do damage went up enormously.
There was a certain point when we teamed up where we decided that it's okay to do architecture more. There was a moment at which we expanded our horizons to include more built projects, and we were really lucky because
we never went after
we never had to look for work. We never had to solicit. Work came to us, and we grew organically with the work.
The Brasserie restaurant got us a lot of publicity, and I think because of that and a few other projects, we received an invitation for a new building on the Boston waterfront.
This was the first time after stepping into the museum and gallery context that we were actually asked to speak in the voice of the museum. We were always the artists inside of the museum or outside critiquing it, and all of a sudden, how do we wrap our heads around making a new museum structure?
It was around that time that you were saying the target and the weapon could be the same.
The ICA had decided on having a single-story gallery. However, the site on the harbor wasn't big enough for a single-level gallery. It would overlap the public space, that is the harbor walk that surrounds Boston Harbor.
As it went by buildings, the buildings just were there. They didn't engage the harbor walk. What the ICA did was said that the harbor walk and the building could produce a new public space.
The strategy was to take the harbor walk and to extend it into the footprint of our site and then roll it up into the grandstand, which then folds deeper into the theatrical space, which then comes around and becomes the underside of the cantilever. Its wooden surface represents the space of the public.
What was important too is it's not only the harbor walk, but the whole ground floor of the building. That whole ground level is open to the public. You don't have to buy a ticket to appreciate it and to enjoy it. I know when I first came to the city, public was the sidewalk. Everything else was private. And the moment you came to a door, if you were going into a lobby, you were going into private space. And I think what we've tried to do for many years now is to break that barrier down, to blur the boundaries between what is public and what is private.
A little more than 50 years ago, President Eisenhower put a shovel in the ground in a slum area known as San Juan Hill.
Amid 12 acres of loft buildings and grimy tenements, President Eisenhower prepares to break ground for the new Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, a major facelifting for Manhattan's West Side.
It was, at its time, a dazzling idea that you would group performing arts institutions and call it a campus.
To get an idea of what the neighborhood was like before Lincoln Center, paid close attention to the opening minutes of the 1961 movie version of West Side Story, which was in fact filmed in and around the semi-demolished brownstone tenement structures that stood on the site.
The very initial decisions were made by John D. Rockefeller.
And Rockefeller is very much a proponent of the clean sweep urban renewal, or what critics of that approach would call urban removal, on a Corbusian scale, where one just creates a blank slate, you tear down everything that's there. Essentially, it was deemed a much too large a project to be handled by one architect alone. The principal figure was Wallace K. Harrison, who was the court architect of the Rockefeller family. He turned to his partner, Max Abramovich, to design a Philharmonic Hall, what is now Avery Fisher Hall. Harrison took for himself the Plum Commission of the Metropolitan Opera House. And for the flanking building, he chose Philip Johnson. In addition, they also brought aboard Eros Saarinen to design the Vivian Beaumont Theater, and Pietro Beluschi, the Pacific Northwest modernist, to design the Juilliard School of Music. The mandate that was given to all the architects was to work in a sort of stripped down and updated quasi-classical mode. I came to New York, I think the very day that the Metropolitan Opera opened in 1966. And I remember the scathing review that Ada Louise Huxtable delivered in the New York Times, and I think very deservedly so. The three principal buildings were never well received. I think there was a sense of that sort of daintiness and fussiness and decorative doodaddery. Perhaps the best received of all was Beluschi's building, which finally opened in 1969.
You know, if a camel is a horse designed by a committee, Lincoln Center, was a camel. It was all the best architects in America at that time collaborated to produce the worst cultural center in the history of the planet. So eventually, it will take some kind of kung fu master to come in there and try to fix this thing.
Lincoln Center was created on a plinth. It was created to protect concert goers from a pretty dangerous city around it.
The plinth elevated all of these institutions on a base with solid travertine walls that are well above eye level and are almost 2 stories high around the corner on 65th Street, making it inaccessible psychologically and physically.
It was conceived as a bastion, a sort of island of culture, an elitist acropolis for rich New Yorkers.
It was remote. It turned its back on its neighborhood. It was just a product of another time.
When Lincoln Center was first formulated, and the architects knew exactly what they were doing, they didn't really want to have people spaces.
I remember when they said those spaces were designed to be barren, kind of Antonioni spaces.
There was really no reason to go there except for a performance.
Putting great art on world-class stages was not sufficient to draw audiences in the 21st century. Sufficiency resided in social discourse. and creating a place that people want to come and hang out and linger. The intention was to bring some of the leading architects in the world to Lincoln Center. Raphael Moneo, Richard Meyer, Norman Foster.
Remember the Lincoln Center, other architects, much more famous, had failed. So how did they get from this early experimental artwork, very edgy, off-Broadway, to being right in the middle of Broadway, big stage, big success?
We found ourselves in an interview where we were asked, what are our thoughts about Lincoln Center? We actually had some, and we felt that because we were so improbable, we had nothing to lose. To me and to our studio, this was an important piece of surgery that needed to be done, and we were very equipped to do it because we had strong opinions about it, love, hate.
We decided, much to the surprise, I think, of the architectural community, on Diller Scofidio and Renfro.
We started by imagining a Lincoln Center that we would like to go to, even if we didn't have tickets to an event. It was really about making good on the publicness of the public spaces.
Our original scope was to transform 65th Street into a street of the arts.
I was amazed by the removal of that awful bridge across 65th Street.
This bridge killed 65th Street, absolutely drained it of its life. There were a couple of fluorescent lights, 7 lanes of traffic. There were 13 institutions along the street, not a single front door. It was very inhospitable. Our first move was to take 2 lanes of traffic out of the street, to widen the sidewalk, and to bring every constituent organization's front door down to the street. All of this activity would then spill out onto the street, and has spilled out onto the street, giving it a reflection of all of the diverse things that are going on inside the center.
Lincoln Center for so long was a wall,
Lincoln Center is a symphony of sight and sound.
and very few people really knew what was going on. They knew there were a few theaters, but the amount of activity, the richness of activity, was something that really had to be brought out to the public.
And some of our installations, like the info blades or the LED stairs, involved really kind of new notions of a marquee, where we can bring out the energy through text and through images and through dynamic graphics. What was happening inside? Text became a building material like any other material.
The sharing of information was to be equal between the visitor, the theater goer, the student, the performer.
But it wasn't just that. It was then also coupled with that marvelous berm, which takes one's eye up and visually across that now wonderfully open space back towards Juilliard.
This plot of land actually is replacing what used to be the Millstein Plaza that crossed 65th Street. The problem was that we also had to solve another issue, which was to make a destination restaurant. And there wasn't enough real estate on the site. So we came to the conclusion that if we stack these 2 programs, the lawn above the restaurant, that we could actually make something that was really extraordinary. We wanted to make this pasture a kind of artificial nature in New York, but its section actually has this unique high par form. So it is a rectangle with 2 high sides and 2 lower sides. But the lower sides are also at different elevations. Along the ridge, there's a curvature, and it produces a kind of topographic effect. It's very subtle, and as you move through, you really feel the topography switch over. students can hang out. There are seminars that happen here. People just bring a bottle of wine and some food. It kind of closes the deal on this notion of culture and leisure and starting to break down these absolute divisions where culture is aloof. A lot of the work that we did at Lincoln Center was not really motivated by pragmatics. There was a vision as to how to bring it into the 21st century or how to make a link that was never made before. It's not only travertine and steel, it's not only that material stuff, it's a lot of old ideas about urbanism that really don't work today. So we found ourselves kind of renovating urbanistic strategies, which are very hard to do with architecture.
Lincoln Center realized that to remake the center as an open, communal place, they had to actually do a much more sweeping renovation.
Slowly and surgically, they start fixing problems all over. Sort of dance their way through all of these structures and all of these clients, trying to make everybody happy, which is impossible. In a strange way, since nobody thought it could be done, I think people said yes to lots of stuff, never thinking that it would really, really, really happen.
Juilliard, it's one of New York's finest examples of brutalist architecture. We didn't want to strip away the salient features of the building, disguise it, overwhelm it. Rather, we wanted to make it sort of more Beluski than it started out.
They address its main problem, which is that it really was too brutal a street presence.
The first act was to strip the stone base off of the first floor, revealing the 3 theaters that are inside. Beautiful elements that were never understood by the public. It's just a sheet of glass an inch thick going all the way down 65th Street to allow people to feel as much a part of the interior of that building as they could. The other thing that we did is we added on an addition to the Juilliard School 50,000 square feet. We wanted all of our work here to be pulled from the DNA of Lincoln Center, but we wanted to crossbreed a little contemporaneity.
This is actually a very good spot to look at the expansion of Juilliard. You could actually see a faint joint line there of the travertine between the old and the new travertine. And you could see where the logic of the fenestration totally changes. We slipped in another floor. The pattern of punch windows are now blind windows that actually fill up. There's a kind of flattening out of the depth of the blind window.
And our new windows are 3-dimensional in nature, rolling over Beluski's original pattern.
The manufacturers went crazy because they'd never seen windows like that. They're prismatic. They do some really funny things that are very, very difficult to detail. But we're very happy with the way that this facade came out because on the one hand, it feels like nothing happened. This feels like a natural side of Juilliard. But then when you look close, something very oddball going on.
While they kept the rhythm and coolness of the facade along 65th Street, as you turn into the diagonal of Broadway, their diagonal opens up. And there's that wonderful moment with the Gloria Kaufman Dance Studio where you see the dancers. And their earliest experiments in screens is brought to wonderful architectonic and full-scale blurring of, again, the boundaries between public and private, inside and out.
This space is suspended, literally hanging from the sloping surface that you see here. This is the roof of the Alice Tully lobby. So we're an object, almost like a pearl, lodged in Alice Tully's open jaw. One of the things we wanted to do was turn Juilliard inside out a little bit to show New York City the activity that's in here, to let people perform to the streets. Right now, we're standing on top of the slope that is the ceiling of Alice Tully Hall's new lobby. It's a cantilevered section of floor plate, cantilevered 65 feet, so there are no columns underneath us. And the entire glass wall is held by one single steel truss that goes from 66th Street to 65th Street, suspending these glass fins that have no metal in them. It's the least metalled glass curtain wall in New York City.
When we decided to expand Juilliard, we made a kind of ready-made canopy that could frame Tully Hall and really expose it to the street. We wanted to make this all publicly accessible space. So you could come in off the street, have a cup of coffee, hang out here, and you don't have to have tickets for the show, just simply be in this space. You could see the sheerness of the glass line, the continuity of the steps. Every gesture really has to do with making the interface as transparent as we could make it. I kind of like to just stand here and watch. In the High Line, the 10th Avenue overlook, we wanted in that case to defamiliarize the everyday and to put it on display. In this situation, we did something different. The public can just simply hang out and watch the lobby, and the lobby can watch this little grandstand.
One of the great strengths that Diller Scofidio Renfro has now is extending the reach of buildings beyond the sense of the four walls of the structure.
This is a common approach to remaking a lot of the public space in Lincoln Center, where we tried to turn the performance experience inside out, to make the arrival sequence as theatrical as being in the theater itself.
So the classic understanding of architecture would be that it's an object in front of you that you see. What they do and what they love most is to sort of scrape away at the way the sort of visual field operates. It's not what you see, but how you see. And if you look at when they moved into architecture, that's what they tried to do. They tried to make an architecture which was itself a kind of an eyeball. You know, if you think about the Slough House, it's really just a kind of weird eyeball.
Slough House was actually their first commission for something to be built. The whole house bent towards the water, but it transformed one of the major conventions of private houses in any scenic position, that is the picture window. In the picture window was inserted a monitor which looked back into the house and which recorded the vision of the water over the time that the weekend visitors has been away. And so when you came to the house, you were not only looking at the water, but you were also looking at the filmed vision of what the house had seen over the period before you'd been there.
Now, the more and more professional they get, there's the dilemma, right? Because if you say to your client, hey, I really want to get inside your eyeball, the client might say, I think I want someone else to do my theater, right? But if you make an auditorium, it's a machine for listening, obviously, but it's also listening immersed in a visual field. So you can see at Lincoln Center what they try to do is insert their kind of visual rigor into an acoustic rigor.
Acoustics are kind of a black magic. The most surprising thing that we began to learn, as this is our first concert hall, is this phenomenon called psychoacoustics, which is if you can see the stage better and if the room feels good, you can actually hear it better. Architects like to shine light through everything. It's a little bit like children putting everything up their nose. Architects like to just put a flashlight to any material and see if it glows. It got into our brains that It would be fantastic if we changed the behavior of wood. We decided to laminate a thin veneer of the same wood that you're seeing everywhere and backlight with LEDs. When the audience comes into the hall and just before the show goes on, this blush comes over the walls. It was a kind of human and organic effect. This was such a fantastic learning experience. Lincoln Center allowed us to play. They didn't use the criteria of have you ever designed a hall, so they were willing to take a risk. This entire project was pretty freewheeling and open-ended. We went to Josie Robertson Plaza and decided, well, let's just change the whole thing entirely. And that's the first time that we actually got stopped in the entire redevelopment. Lincoln Center said, well, that's something that's really iconic to us. We were always weighing the kind of internal politics and external politics and how to make the right thing happen. For example, the drop-off along Columbus Avenue. Other people have thought about getting rid of the road, but no one was able to make that happen. In the end, the patrons of Lincoln Center still wanted to be dropped off very close to the venues. So by depressing the road, we were able to get both done.
We've gotten rid of this short, steep flight of stairs and yet another road that you had to cross. We've made it inviting. We've made it a place that you can stroll into.
What they've done is to change everything, but have people feel like only small adjustments were made. But overall, you have this weird sense that this is how it always was, or this is how it should have been.
And I'll take you to my favorite spot. This, I find, just the most incredible space with these smokestacks, chimneys, the kind of narrowness of it. You really feel kind of the industrial nature of the space as it existed many years ago. It's a space that I'm sure will disappear at some point, but for me it's very magical.
I think it's just remarkable that we now have these 3 local architects who are so committed to the city.
We kind of think of these projects in a very greedy way. We're New Yorkers, we're citizens of New York. Wouldn't it be great to have spaces that we could be in, that we could use? And think of yourself as the client.
So it's populism of a very high order. Both the High Line and Lincoln Center have had a really euphoric effect on life in New York.
They mark the beginning of an attempt to reconstruct a generosity to the public.